Good evening and welcome to Information Please, your Peoria Public Library on the air, bringing you information about your library and your community. And this evening, my guest is author Ken Zurski. Hi.
Hi there.
Thanks for coming on.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
You're going to be with us at Peoria Public Library on Monday, October 15th for a book talk and signing about your book here, which is The Wreck of the Columbia. And this is your first book, isn't it?
It is my first book. It's been an interesting experience. I wasn't really planning on doing a book. It kind of turned into a book as I started doing the research, but I'm very glad with how it's come out.
Oh, good. What made you start researching this?
I have a reporter's background, journalism background. Obviously, I do radio and reporting, but mostly traffic reporting, which isn't a lot of research. It's mostly immediate reporting when you do traffic. So I was looking for a project. I was looking for something that I wanted to kind of delve into and study something, find a story. I was reading a lot of nonfiction stories, a lot of historical stories, a lot of forgotten stories, and I was reading about the Eastland disaster in Chicago, which was the boat that tipped over in the Chicago River in 1915, which was 3 years before the Columbia. And it was a fascinating read, and it was about, stories about people and survival. There were 800 people who were killed in that accident. It's just tragic. And I was asking someone here in this area if they had heard about the Eastland, and they said, oh yeah, but there was a boat wreck here in Pekin, in the Pekin area. And I go, really? And then a kind of light went off in my head, and I thought, well, there's the story I'm looking for, just something to do research for, go to the library, look, because I love doing that. So I started doing research on the story and found things that had already been written about it, some articles and newspaper clippings, and felt that even though there was a lot to the story, there was a lot more to it that happened even after the wreck, like the investigation. That was the part I really wanted to find out about. So
yeah, like what happened? What were the results of all this?
Right. What happened to the pilot and the captain, and was there a trial? Did they go to trial? Were they convicted? Those kind of things were really, even though there was parts of the story that were there was a lot of parts that were missing. That's what I enjoyed doing, is finding those parts that were missing. As soon as I did, and I realized I had what could be a book here, a project that had turned into a book, that's when I seriously started thinking about writing the story.
Okay. Because I think people in this area, sometimes if you say, have you heard of the Columbia disaster, they'll go, oh yeah, but they don't really know the facts. They know something happened and people died, but they don't know what happened to the boat, or how many people died, or how bad it was, or anything else. So maybe can you give us, kind of whet our appetite a little bit and give us kind of what the background of this, what happened to these people?
Well, steamboats are very popular in Peoria. This is 1918. This is around the 4th of July holiday, so they were very crowded. And they were excursion boats back then. A lot of the steamboats that were used being for freight, packet boats at the turn of the century, they're starting to fade away, and they were being renovated into these excursion boats or party boats where people would get on. They would charter these boats. They would get on the boats for evening cruises, sometimes day-long cruises. There'd be an orchestra. There'd be dancing, drinking, socializing, playing cards. Men would play cards on there. The top deck was used for kind of an open-air viewing, and the boats would cruise maybe 3-4 hours. For an evening cruise, it'd be about a 4-hour cruise. And they were very popular. There were at one point they said there were at least 24 steamboats parked on Peoria's shoreline at one point during this time. So I mean, for entertainment and for transportation, this is the way they used the boats. And this boat was chartered on the night of July 5th, so it was the day after the 4th of July holiday. This boat was chartered by a Southside Social Club of Pekin. Had chartered the boat. It was about half full to capacity when it left Pekin, with about 500 passengers, and went up to Peoria, up to the Al Fresco amusement park, which is
very popular.
When I started reading about the story of the Columbia, and they mentioned this Al Fresco, I go, wow, amusement park, was where Peoria Heights is basically now. Basically, it was at the bottom of the bluff of Grandview Drive.
Yeah.
The trolley cars would come up to the bluff where you could walk now, that area there off of Grandview Drive, and there'd be a path that would go down to the park itself, and it was very popular. A lot of people who've read the book seem to think, they tell me that their ancestors remember the amusement park as much as they do remember the wreck of the Columbia. But They had a figure-8 roller coaster there at the amusement park. That was kind of one of the first ever figure-8 roller coasters. That was the big draw.
Wow.
So these steamboat owners, realized a good thing, and they could take these boats on moonlight cruises, go up to the Al Fresco amusement park there for a time while the passengers got off the boat, get back on the boat, bring them back, and they had promised the passengers this night that they'd be back before midnight. And everything was going well. They stopped off at the amusement park for about a half hour, only a half hour.
I can't do much in that
They had to
amount of
keep
time.
on the schedule.
Yeah.
And they'd blow the whistle, and everyone would come running and come running up the stage plank there, back on the boat. And the boat started sailing back downriver, and it came to a point of the river which is called the Wesley City Bend or the Wesley City Sandbar. And Wesley City used to be what is Creve Coeur now.
Oh, okay.
That's why you get Wesley Road going along the river. It used to be Wesley City.
Okay.
The boat was coming around that bend and coming up to what was called the Wesley City Sandbar. And the pilots knew it was there. It was a little dangerous, but they could navigate around it. There was a little bit of mist or fog in the air. The pilot lost a little bit of control of the boat, somewhat due to the fact that most of the passengers, and there was half full to capacity, were up in the front of the boat. Plus it was full of coal. You had the coal, the reserve coal, in the front of the boat. So it was very front heavy, very bow heavy, and the stern was very light. So as he tried to maneuver around the sandbar, the boat became what they called in the book, one of the divers called it loggy. It became a loggy. Not sure how.
Kind of like fishtailing a trailer.
Right. And it went up against the shore, and it busted out a window. One of the willows against the Peoria County shore busted out a window. And the passengers were kind of alarmed a bit, like what was that?
Yeah.
But they really weren't too worried about it. And the captain was a little worried, thinking maybe something might have pierced the hull. So he had somebody go down into the hull and check for water, and they did discover that there was enough water in the hull for it to be a problem. So the captain shouted up to his pilot, run her ashore, run her ashore. Well, the boat at that point was not pointing towards the Peoria County side, which is really where they were at.
Yeah.
It was the bow was pointing more towards the Tazewell County shore because the stern had hit. So the pilot had decided, made what appears to be now a fateful decision, to just steam the boat ahead towards the Tazewell County shore because that's where the boat was headed. They got about halfway, which would be the middle of the river, and the boat was obviously losing buoyancy, was starting to sink, which isn't a horrible thing if the boat goes down because the river is only about 20 feet deep at its deepest point. So the captains and the pilots weren't too worried about a boat sinking. They weren't worried about it capsizing. Those flat-bottomed hulls were pretty sturdy. It wasn't going to capsize, but sinking, they'd sink 20 feet. More of the boat would be above water. Most
Than
people
below.
could they'd just run up to the top and they'd be fine. But what happened here is the passengers heard the sound of timbers starting to crack, and the boat basically pancaked on top of itself.
Oh,
Each
no.
deck went one onto the other, and most of the people, 87 people, perished. Most of them died almost instantly because they didn't drown. They were killed by blunt force, or what they called at the time violence. They were killed by a violent death. Wood beams and the cross beams of the holding the decks,
cracked.
the supports came down.
So when they hit this tree, did that undo something?
The tree,
important?
well, it certainly got everyone's attention because the tree and the hanging willows on the Peoria County side, the two sides were very different because the Peoria County side had mostly hanging willows and what they called submerged stumps and trees that had fallen in the water. It wasn't a side that you want to park a boat. It isn't even a side you really want to bring the boat too close to shore for that reason. You'll usually hit a tree branch and that might break out a window, which it did.
Yeah.
The other side, the Wesley City side, there was a somewhat sandy shore there. There were shanties, houseboats, cabin boats they called them. A lot of the coal miners who worked in the area, a lot of the fishermen lived on the shoreline there. So there was a place to land on that side, which may have been another reason why the pilot made that decision to move the boat, steam the boat ahead towards the Tazewell County shore.
Not knowing there was structural damage.
Well, yeah, exactly. Or even just wait, just stay where you're at and determine what's wrong with the boat before you make any actions. And that's kind of where the investigations went too. It's like, did the captain and pilot make the right decisions? At that you look at it now and you have to say that they likely did not, because that was the decision to go to the middle of the river towards the Tazewell County side. No one expected the boat to, collapse and basically fall apart, which it did. But that's what happened.
Wow. Well, we have some pictures here.
This is the Columbia, and this is probably 1910, so several years, could be a decade before the boat wreck itself. Not sure exactly where this was taken. This could have been in Peoria. I was trying to look at some of the background there and trying to determine exactly where this was taken, but it gives you some idea of what it was like. It looks like they're exiting here, that the boat or the cruise,
pulling away from the shore.
It looks like they're coming back out after a cruise there, and it was a typical looking steamboat. I mean, this is the way steamboats looked back then. 3 decks. The bottom deck was used mainly there was an ice cream parlor there, like a stand, and there was tables where they would play cards, and this is where the bar was at too. The second deck was always the most crowded. That was the dance floor deck. And then the top deck, like I said, was used mainly for viewing, if you want to just go up and enjoy the view of the open air. And then, of course, the top of the ship is always the pilot house. And just to get some sense of how big it is here, it's about 125 feet long. A ship of this size is about 45 feet or a little taller, 50 feet tall. The wheel was about 12 feet wide. And just a massive thing up there.
Huge,
it's hard to tell
wheel.
there. There are pictures of the inside of a pilot house where someone's standing there, and you just realize just how
enormous
large these pilot wheels were. But one distinctive feature about the Columbia was this acorn-shaped top, this open-air top there.
Yeah, it looks almost rather oriental.
It does, almost like an Orthodox church top to a church in Moscow. Yeah, it kind of has that cupola type looking shape to it, and that was its distinctive feature for the Columbia. And whenever I see old pictures of steamboats, especially here in Peoria, I always look for that, and I can always tell there it is.
See what
There's
it looks like.
And they did have the name. You don't see it there, but there was the name Columbia was painted on the side, and usually painted on the paddle wheel too, so you knew what was the boat.
What boat was going.
Yeah, this is typical of what it looked like I said, about a decade before. There were modifications made to the boat to make it more an excursion boat. In fact, it looked very different. You'll see in some of the other pictures, it looked very different the night that it sank, because the captain had made a lot of improvements, especially to the dance hall deck there. He actually extended the wall out and eliminated that whole deck rail here. And you'll see that in another picture. You'll see it looks distinctively different than it does here. This looks like a steamboat, and when the way the boat looked the night that it sank, it looks more boxy, because he, again, eliminated that second deck rail.
Okay. And where did you find this picture?
This picture is in a steamboat collection in the Murphy Library in La Crosse, Wisconsin. A steamboat enthusiast, I like to call him, who's in a national organization of people who love this type of stuff, had told me that they had a great digital collection. And they did. They had a wonderful collection online. You can go online and see all this. And they had a lot of the boat itself, and as well as a lot of the wreck photos. They have digitized, and a lot of that I used for the book. And these are mostly pictures you see here are from that collection.
Oh, cool, cool. Well, let's look at another picture here then.
Well, we go right to the gruesome aspects of the wreck, which was the recovery of the bodies. It happened in the middle of the night, so it was dark, and even though a lot of the coal miners and the fishermen who heard the screams got in their boats and came out to the boat very quickly that night. It was just too dark for any real exploration, and they also pretty much realized that they weren't really saving anybody at that point. They were saving those who were in the water. Some people knew how to swim back then, some people didn't. Those who were in the water, they were able to save, but a lot of people who were trapped by all the debris were likely already dead. In fact, there weren't many moans or cries coming after literally an hour or so after they got there. So they decided it was too dark to do any more work. They waited in the rowboats until morning and daybreak, and then at daybreak they started what I would have to call the the recovery of the bodies. And this is what you see here. What they did with a lot of the bodies is once they were able to snag them, they used pike poles to snag the bodies out of the river. And this is one of the divers. His name was Barney Walt, and he was from Peoria. He was an auto mechanic. But he had a diving suit, and he knew how to dive. And so the coroner of Tazewell County, his name was Lawrence Clary, decided not only was he calling a diver from Chicago who knew a little something about shipwrecks, a guy who worked on the Eastland, but to get the work started in the morning, the next morning, he called this Earl Barney Walt in the middle of the night and said, you know, you got a diving suit? I need you.
Wow.
and he came with his crew, a big barge boat with the big pump, you know, and hooked it up to the big fishbowl-looking helmet type
and
thing.
There's another whole topic to research is diving. And
diving
I'm sure you can find that at Peoria Public Library as well. I'm sure we have a book on it.
Yes, it's very interesting. They used diving bells back then too, which is like an open bottom. It just was able to, I don't know.
Well, it's like putting a cup down in water that there's air in it.
They didn't use that. The tugboat on that last shot there, they would put the bodies on the tugboat, and that's how they sent the first bodies they sent downriver. And they had told the people in Pekin who had gathered at the police station, who were wondering, you know, knew their loved ones on the boat, wondering if they were one of the victims. They told them that the first tugboat was going to come downriver at first light. Can you imagine going down to the shoreline, not knowing whether your loved one at that point, maybe your loved one hadn't returned,
right? And
going down there and looking and waiting for this tugboat, and someone had described that the bodies were stacked up like cordwood on the bow of the tugboat.
Right. Wow.
And then going through, they put the bodies in a morgue there, and then they had to lift the sheets, and you would identify.
Yeah, it's like all disasters, a terrible, terrible thing.
You do hear a lot of that.
The families.
They have to identify the bodies simply by looking and going through each body and finding their loved one.
Finding who's there.
This is the Columbia as it looked, and you could tell, you could see it's in the bottom of the river, the hull, but obviously the rest of the boat just kind of collapsed on top
it's
itself,
all
and
sort of pancaked.
Yeah, I describe it in the book as it looking like a broken toy. It looks like a toy that just broke. Somebody had dropped it, and it just broke. It was pretty amazing.
And the flag is still flying there, stretched out in the breeze.
Yes, that's a lighted flag that Captain Mail is his name, M-E-H-L, Mail. He had put those lighted flags on the boat because it was the 4th of July. He had there were boats from bow to stern, and maybe about 14 of regular flags. But there were 2 of the lighted flags, one facing each direction. And a reporter at the time had noticed this scene. He was looking at this particular scene. It's interesting, you noticed it too, noticing the lighted flags, and he had made a comment that not a globe was broken, that what had survived was the lighted flag had survived this horrible looking wreck. But you could see it's still intact.
Wow. Do you know what day of the week this was?
This was on a Friday night.
Okay.
July 5th on a Friday.
So a lot of people probably didn't have to go to work the next day.
Right.
I was thinking about that. Why are people out cruising at midnight?
Yeah, right.
But if it's a Friday night, then probably many people did not work.
Right.
Especially if
it was
the holiday.
It was a holiday weekend too,
right.
So maybe they even had that Friday off. I'm not sure back then.
Yeah, what
knows?
People did.
But yeah, it was a Friday night. I mean, it was
Did you look up to see what the weather was?
Yeah, it was fair skies is what they said. Unsettled, you know, what back then means maybe there'll be some rain, maybe not. You know, it didn't. There was no reports of any rain, just that kind of misty fog that they had reported that night. It did rain more. In fact, there was a big storm the Saturday after the accident. And that's a chapter in the book because they were worried that not only would maybe the wreckage shift, maybe bodies would be dislodged from the wreckage and float downriver. They were worried that
because of the storm.
Yeah, and it was a bad storm. It was knocking. They said there were carnival tents that were knocked over in Peoria. I mean, it was a pretty bad storm. But the boat didn't move. It didn't move.
It held, stayed put.
Yeah.
And do you know what the moon phase was? Was it dark?
I don't. No, I don't.
We can find that out at the library too.
That'd be interesting. They do say that it was, everyone who seemed to testify that night seemed to say that it was very dark.
Very dark.
It sounds like it was pretty dark that night.
Okay. Well, let's see if we can pull up another slide here. There's one.
There it is. That's the way the boat looked that night. You see how dramatically different it does look.
Yes.
That whole deck rail is gone from the second. There's even like almost a top awning here, which was open-aired before. Of course, the one distinctive feature is still there, which is the acorn-shaped top. And but the wall of the dance floor was extended out to the very end of the boat there. There's no more railing, no more walkway there. And that year before the excursion season, Captain Mayle had made those improvements. He even said he made some improvements to the hull, steel reinforced some of the hull, and was given an inspection. Obviously, every year the boats go through the federal inspections. And they were even more, detailed than they usually are because of the Eastland disaster, especially in Illinois.
Certainly.
So
the way we're all inspecting bridges now.
exactly right.
When
Something
disaster.
happens, a disaster happens, and everyone is obviously more aware. And
I noticed that it says safety first on the side.
well, that's the thing. He was so proud that he got a glowing report from the federal inspectors. In fact, their quote was, "It's the safest boat in Western waters," is what they called it.
Wow.
So he ended up putting that year as the only year he had that up. He put safety first on the side of the boat.
A little bit reminiscent
Yeah,
of
it is.
the Titanic with the
Exactly.
unsinkable Titanic,
Exactly.
and the safest boat in Western waters
Yeah.
also didn't make it. That's interesting. Very interesting.
And there's the way the boat looked. Kind of described the boat in the book as one of the smokestacks fell off to the side here. One of the smokestacks actually fell on top of the boat. This is an awning here, and some of the passengers that were able to escape talked about walking on the awning and having it slip through or break through, and so it was very unstable. Some of the people who were able to make it out were able to walk gingerly on the wreckage and make it, at least hold on until someone
Could get there to get them
and be rescued. Yeah.
Well, by 1918, when this sunk, women's clothing was less extensive.
Yes.
And even a few years earlier, many of the women probably would have been pulled down by the weight of their clothing, which was a common fate for
Yes.
women who fell off of a boat or slipped into the water or something.
Yeah.
So
I get into a little bit in the book about that, because obviously we were in the war now, so women had a
Yes.
different role, and they were working in
Yes.
factories, and they were doing more jobs. And those I mentioned the floor sweeping garments were no longer, women were wearing shorter skirts, and they were wearing shorter hair or bobbing their hair.
Yeah.
The bob look was becoming popular, and so you're right. They were still somewhat a heavy cotton fabric.
yeah, but
which
they
was
didn't
still,
have 7 yards in their skirt anymore.
Exactly.
The fashions had changed, and that's
And there is a
unfortunate.
description of the guys who came and really had to kind of heave the people out of the water and onto the boats. But you're right, these longer garments and the heavier garments were they weren't as prominent then. It was definitely changing.
Yeah, that's great. And well, it's great that not so many people were pulled under by their clothing at that point. Also, I know one of the things that used to be terrifying to people on steamboats in earlier eras was the explosions. And I don't know, were there many explosions of steamboats at this time, or had they pretty well
At
solved
this time, they
those
had modified the
mechanical problems?
boilers and the furnaces where they weren't quite as dangerous. But there was a time before the turn of the century where steamboats were extremely dangerous, and boiler explosions were very, very common. And catastrophic loss of life. The Sultana was still the worst inland water disaster, which was just after the Civil War ended. It was a loaded steamboat of Civil War prisoners had boarded the boat. They were just released. They had overloaded this boat, and the boiler blew, and over 1,000 were killed in that.
Where did that one happen?
That's a good question. I think it was
I
down.
know I've heard of it, but I can't remember
It was down,
where it
I
was.
think, towards Memphis, but I might be wrong. And it was on the Mississippi.
But we can look it up
Yeah.
at the
Isn't
library.
that fun?
You could go online right now and look it up on
Well, and
Britannica.
that's the thing when you read, and what I love about reading nonfiction historical books is you come across something like that and you go, well, now I've got to go check the Sultana and find out about
more,
that. And there are books about the Sultana, just like the Columbia book, so you can keep that ball rolling. That's a lot of fun.
Great. Do you know of any explosions that happened in the Peoria area earlier?
Well, there was a explosion on a boat that was called the Prairie State. There's not a whole lot of information about that, and some say that could be the worst disaster because they were really not sure how many people died in that boat. There are some that say there was only 40 and some that say there were over 100. The Columbia has been always considered the worst maritime accident on the Illinois River simply because we have records that say there were 87 people who died. If the Prairie State was back in the later 1800s, I'm not sure exactly the time there, but it was when a lot of immigrants were coming into the area and the boiler exploded on that. And interesting part of Pekin's history, because a lot of people, the boat was docked in the Pekin area there on the river, and a lot of the people who were injured ended up being nursed in town, and they just ended up staying.
Oh.
So a lot of those people ended up being part of Pekin's history.
Interesting genealogical exercise to find out if you had a relative on the Columbia during that fateful night. So.
I'm hearing some of those stories. People are coming forward and saying, my grandmother was on the boat, or my great uncle or great aunt. So those are really interesting personal stories of people. Some people read the book and they tell me they gasp because they come across the name of their ancestor.
Of an ancestor.
And they knew just the story of your great uncle was on the boat, but we don't know what happened. And then
they get that.
They get that and find out exactly what happened to them. It's interesting.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Everybody can meet Ken and hear first person and ask your questions and see pictures and buy your own copy of the book and probably get it autographed too. It's a fundraiser for the Friends of Peoria Public Library, and it is on Monday, October 15th at Peoria Public Library North Branch at 6 p.m. It'll be a great night of talk and discovery. And remember, if you're interested in more about the steamboats, you can find out all sorts of things in our local history and genealogy department. I know I've seen some great pictures of the banks of the river by Peoria just completely lined with steamboats. So don't miss those rare sights and sounds we have at our local history and genealogy department. And we will be talking about a lot more things that are happening at Peoria Public Library next week. So we'll see you next week on Information Please.